So we're continuing with the second presentation of this session, and let us welcome the second speaker, Mr. Robert MacMillan, who is the head of Cyber Security at the Virgin Mobile in the United Arab Emirates. And in his daily life, Robert is a senior level consultant with a broad range of skills developed over 25 years of experience in IT. With roots in software development, Robert can write code and program. However, his interest lies into strategy and technology alignment, and he has built a solid history of identifying trends ahead of the curve. Additionally, in recent years, Robert has invested his time advising and guiding 6 technology startups through their early stage of product development and rollout into the market. So, Mr., the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay. So I want to begin by saying I actually made these slides quite a bit heavier because I tried to make a little bit more of a reference document for people. So I'm going to talk around the slides, and there's going to be more in the slides than we're actually going to cover. So just wanted everyone to just be aware of that. So the title of this talk is Stop Chasing Security. So a lot of the times when we're sitting in an environment and when you're responsible for the IT security of your enterprise, you invest a lot of money and you spend a lot of money buying technologies and making investments into things that are designed to stop problems from happening. The reality today, though, is no matter what you've invested in, no matter what you've actually purchased, and no matter what you've implemented, stuff is still going to go wrong. So we need to find an alternative way and an alternative approach to solving these kinds of challenges. The purpose of the talk today is to have a conversation around a framework that we can adopt in order to actually start addressing these kinds of challenges, specifically in the context of malware. Okay? So again, the reality is defenses fail. No, if everyone here had to answer the question right now in your own enterprise, if you thought about it, if you had to answer the question, am I breached right now? Can you prove to me right now that you're not breached? Could you do it? No, that's great. Because most people don't admit to that actual answer. So one of my favorite questions when I start talking to executives is to ask them that question, and then they bring in their actual CISOs, or they bring in their IT directors, and they start dancing around the question. So I often hear statements along the lines of, well, we just bought the latest, greatest defenses. We just bought modern EDR, modern EPP technology. We don't have these kinds of problems. Or defenses we don't need to worry about that. We have a defense in depth strategy. We bought a whole bunch of things, so if something gets through one, we'll be able to catch it another way. So we don't have to actually worry about these kinds of problems. The simple truth is malware breaches, even modern defenses. So I put up a couple of examples of some recent breaches that I've actually personally dealt with in one capacity or another over the last little while. The latest one was a large retail group. So in that particular case, you had a retail operation of about 10,000 endpoints spread around 18 or 19 countries. And they had invested heavily in modern defenses. They were using a modern EDR technology from a leading vendor. They had a lot of network-based security solutions in the perimeter and in the infrastructure in order to identify problems. Within that was actually an interesting one, about a week into the engagement, by the time we were going country to country to country, we ended up identifying about 400 endpoints that were actively breached. And these are endpoints that are actively breached in context of a retail operation. So that means every time someone was going and purchasing something, if the tokenization wasn't done properly or the customer-related data, all of this information was actually put at risk. And in that particular case, they ended up opening up investigations, and in a couple of the countries, they did find a significant number of actually breached cards and a whole bunch of other related problems. Now, again, this isn't because they neglected their defenses. They had the right technology in place. They had the latest modern technologies. They had the latest DDR. Yeah, I can't say it because we're being taped. Hi, everyone, taped. Should have said hi to that at the beginning. Anyway, the point is they had the latest and greatest stuff breaches. So we hear a lot of talk nowadays in terms of vendors that come out and they start presenting and they start talking about threat hunting. And I wanted to have a little bit of a conversation a little bit different today. I want to talk about malware hunting versus threat hunting. So when we talk about threat hunting, what we're really talking about is proactively and iteratively searching through your infrastructure for unknown attackers or unknown things that are actually unknown threats within your estate. So why is malware hunting different? It's not. It's a subset. It's a smaller focus, it's an easier starting point that most enterprises can actually do. The idea behind malware hunting is to focus on workflows that are specifically designed to find softwares that are running in your estate that you don't already know about. These are things that have breached already that are running and undiscovered. Now, on the right-hand side, we have a little diagram. So it sort of shows the time to discovery against the adversary sophistication. This is, I don't remember where this exact one came from, but in practice, detection confidence dictates what organizations can automatically prevent. And that's reflected at the bottom in terms of what you can automatically prevent. In regards to detection, what you actually, when you do detect something, you have to rapidly respond, and it'll be a smaller set of data. So that'll be what your defenses are currently picking up. Maybe you have a Sentinel-1, or maybe you have a Carbon Black, or you have a Fire IHX. Something is being identified and detected, and you take that appropriate action and respond to it. For everything else that's unknown, you have to start hunting for it. You can't assume that any of your defensive tools are really going to find it. So what is the market trying to sell? Generally speaking, they're trying to repurpose defenses. They're trying to take their defensive technologies and find another reason why you should be investing in them. Today, if you start talking to any of the vendors, everyone's a threat hunter. So what does that mean? Everyone's saying they can help you find the unknown data within their infrastructure, within their actual systems. The challenge you have is, what they're trying to sell you is a story. They're trying to tell you you can use the very defensive tools that let malware breach in the first place to then go find that very malware. It doesn't really make a lot of sense, and it doesn't ultimately add up. A lot of the actual solutions that are going into this path are going to take a big data analytics sort of approach to the problem. So when we talk about big data analytics, what we're basically saying is they're going to consolidate your EDR data with your SIM data. They're going to put it together, they're going to start correlating it, and they're going to layer on what I sort of use a moniker called security intelligence. A lot of the analysts will start using a moniker called the UBA, so the end user behavior analytics. I think security intelligence sort of is a little bit of a better way of framing it. The idea is I'm going to normalize that data set. I'm going to look for outliers and high quality leads that were ultimately missed by the defensive tools. And I'm only going to find it because I'm correlating my EDR logs with all my other SIM data. I'm getting actual visibility and access to data that I didn't previously have, and I'm using these new machine learning algorithms that are actually very effective at picking out those outliers. It's another sort of aspect of that they're going to promote is the idea of hypothesis and validation. So coming up with an idea about something that could be happening in my environment, I don't know if it is or not, and starting to look through my logs to see if I can find it. So ultimately, this approach has three main challenges, though. Data access is the first one. So the simple truth is, again, everyone here can correct me in your own organization context, but I've never been into an organization that actually has the logs ready to go that can actually allow us to facilitate doing this kind of work out of the box. It's normally a 6 to 9 month process in order to get enough data to allow us to start taking advantage of this kind of approach. Data completeness. The simple truth is the data is not complete. Your EDR vendors, as a simple example, they don't capture every single event along the application kill chain. They sample. So depending which vendor you are, you're going to have varying degrees of completeness of that data set. As one current sort of frame of it. Another thing that you're missing, no matter what in this context, is the current state of the endpoint. Your logs are historical. They're evidence of things that have already happened, not looking at what actually is happening right now on that endpoint. And independence. Again, this is, data sets from the very defensive tools that let malware breach in the first place. It's not necessarily the wisest thing to rely on. So why do defensive tools ultimately make poor hunters? It's really because of this graph on the right-hand side. The simple truth is a lot of these defensive tools are running in real time. So when you're running in real time, you have to make these split-second decisions about what's going to be allowed and not allowed to run. They're optimized in that way for low false positives. It doesn't matter what vendor you're speaking with, ultimately they're optimized in a real-time system for a low false positive requirement. In contrast, to do malware hunting, you need to have actual data sets that are optimized for low false negatives. We don't want to filter out the low false positives. From a hunting perspective, a false positive or a false negative in this context are leads that we want to investigate through to a conclusion. So our challenge is, how do we remove a lot of that noise? And we'll go through a couple of different methodologies for facilitating that. So how do we start creating a malware hunting program? There's basically 4 methodologies that exist, that are emerging rather in the market today. So we have script-based hunting, we have IOC-based hunting, we have the repurposing of forensic solutions, and we have forensic state analysis, which is what we're going to talk a little bit more in detail in the next section. So script-based hunting, what does that really involve? It involves the idea that I know what I'm going to look for. I want to go onto the endpoint. I might have an IOC. I might have something that I actually think is there. I want to go check real time right now on the endpoint. You can think of it as similar in some ways to the idea of big data threat hunting, only you're not going into a database or a lake of all your actual events. You're going and looking at your endpoints in a live sort of situation. There's quite a few commercial options in the market today. Tenium is one of the most popular that I tend to see deployed out in most enterprises. The main reason being that it's an enterprise product that's been for enterprise management that's been repurposed for this sort of solution or frame or engagement model. Sentinel-1 is another solution. It's an EDR product, but they actually have an ability within the solution to query the endpoints real time, so you can look for additional things. So, as an example, I don't know about in Europe per se, but in the Middle East, we have regulators. So, at the central banks, as an example, will send out notifications to all the banks, and the banks are required to come back and confirm that the presence of those IOCs and all their endpoints don't exist. If they find them, then they have to respond to them. Otherwise, they have to actually respond back to the central bank and certify that they're not actually present. So that would be an example of where you'd want to use a script-based hunting approach. They tend to be quite complex, and they tend to be quite labor-intensive. So as an example of that, one of the big top 5 consulting firms used to work with, they used to use an IOC-based hunting approach on Tenium. So to put it into context, a 10,000 seat engagement or endpoint engagement used to require about 6 different resources and 6 to 7 weeks worth of effort in order to complete the engagement, just as a frame. The second approach we have is IOC-based hunting. So in IOC-based hunting, what we're doing is we're going out to the endpoints and we're looking for the presence of identified signatures, typically Java rules. There's only one product on the market that I know of today that does this. It's from a German company called Nextron Systems. They used to be called BSK Consulting. It's a product called APT Thor by a gentleman who led it initially called Florian Roth. Florian is in this world, he's one of the kings of IOC-based rule creation. And they have quite a few services around that are worth looking into. The challenge with IOCs, again, is you have to know what you're looking for. You already have the problem defined, and you're going out to verify whether you actually do have that issue in your estate. The third option, rather, is repurposing of forensic solutions. So when we talk about forensic solutions, you can repurpose and do this work properly with any of the forensic solutions on the market. This is really the true way to actually do this kind of work. The challenge with this work when you use forensic solutions is they don't scale. How can you go and take the forensic images of 10,000 endpoints and reasonably within a defined period of time validate that every single one of them is reasonably not compromised? It's really difficult and you can't. A real example, there's a law firm out of New York, one of the larger ones. They have a situation of about 2,000, 2,200 endpoints globally spread around. They employ a team of 4 people whose only job it is to capture the memory of those endpoints and validate that they in fact are malware free. It takes them about 50 days with a team of 4 people at New York City salaries in order to validate that enterprise is actually malware free. When they complete the work, they start the entire process over again. So that's the only job that those gentlemen are actually doing in order to validate and make sure that there aren't any problems using this kind of methodology. It's also quite, in context, you need a forensic examiner to do this kind of work. So another methodology that's a little bit more reasonable and more for everyone else is the idea of forensic state analysis. And the reason why it works is because it automates a lot of the forensic processes. So what we're going to ultimately focus on in the methodology are memory, what's currently running in your volatile and non-volatile memory spaces, persistence mechanisms, how malware will survive a reboot or schedule itself to start in the future, and forensic artifacts, evidence of things that have executed in the past. Data is collected and then is ultimately analyzed using a variety of post-breach analytics techniques. And then the framework that we're talking about, the nice thing is that if we follow this kind of framework, you can be as creative as you want to be when it comes to analysis. Ultimately, when we combine live forensic data with analytic techniques, we're able to make the determination of the compromised state of that endpoint within a degree of certainty, which is relatively high. In terms of commercial tools, now full disclosure, one of the companies I advised in the past was InfoSight. So this is their methodology. They developed this methodology in the US Air Force, and this is the same methodology they still use today in the US Air Force in order to conduct these kinds of hunt operations. InfoSight's a commercial version of that was actually created for everyone else. Today, I'm not here to talk about InfoSight. I'm here to talk about the underlying methodology. So we're going to talk about how to build this kind of program without having to go into a commercial offering. There's also some open source tools that implement this that were worth highlighting. So PS Hunt. PS Hunt's an open source version of InfoSight. It's actually what this talk is largely based on. It was actually the first version of InfoSight that was using script-based hunting methodologies, and just at the time, it wasn't possible to do a lot of the work that InfoSight needed to do in order to advance their offering. So, forensic data analysis, what does it really look like? So we have 5 functional components that we have to pull together in order to make this work. We've got scanners and surveys. We've got discovery capabilities or an engine. We've got deployment. How do we get that survey, or how do we actually make those queries? Then, in terms of the results that come back, how do we do survey analysis? And how do we do file analysis? And combine it all together. So scanners and surveys. What are scanners? The idea behind a scanner is I use it, let me take a step back. Scanners. Scanners are used when you want to get a specific piece of information from an endpoint. So if I was looking for example, an IOC, or if I wanted to retrieve a certain file and check for the presence of a certain file, I would use a scanner. So its only purpose is to actually grab one piece of data. In context of a survey is when it's something I would deploy to the endpoint in order to do work on the endpoint to collect a bunch of data on that endpoint. So that could be anything from running processes, it could be from walking the memory, it could be taking the Amcache database or certain pieces of the Amcache database as an example, etc. You can write them in any programming language, and you don't have to compile code, you can do it with scripts. So if you guys are comfortable with Python, or if you're comfortable with PowerShell, use whatever you're comfortable with. Personally, I tend to write these in C# when I actually write them, and I create them. You can use whatever you ultimately want to use. Second component, additional notes for surveys. Sorry, I thought I deleted this one. Doesn't matter. So minimum data sets I typically recommend. Active processes. And I would actually suggest if you guys want to build these kinds of tools, you start looking at the active processes. You can query from the operating system, but you can also take the step of using a tool like PowerShell Forensics as an example and actually grabbing it directly out of memory, even if you don't want to learn how to actually read the memory space yourself or walk it yourself. Loaded modules and drivers that are actually sitting in memory is another important thing to grab out of it. Floating injection modules, you again identify those. You can use not Florian stuff, it's PS Reflect. I just forget who created it. Matt Grober's solution for that. Active connections. What active socket connections are actually happening on that endpoint right now? Persistence mechanisms, so there you're going to look in schedules tasks. ET jobs is another place that people tend to forget a lot of because it's old. Registry run keys, Windows start folders, jump lists, etc. Key event logs, so when people are logging in and logging off as an example, can give you some relatively important information. Accounts, local and AD if you have them because you're writing your tools yourself. Artifacts, shimcache, prefetch, and amcache. There's treasure troves of data in there. So one of the things I like doing is I go through the Amcache databases and the stuff that I write, and I grab all the hashes of that, and I bring all of that information back as well, so I could further enrich what my discoveries were, so I can see things that I had already executed in the past. And what's neat about that is I'm not restricted to just using threat intelligence. Left. Okay. I'm not restricted to just using threat intelligence. I can start also use things like vulnerability feeds. So one of my more recent sort of examples around this is I was speaking with Alien Vault, the AT&T guys, and they've opened up, and it's going to be available to everyone soon. You're going to be able to query vulnerabilities on hashes. So now if you think about this and just take a step back, if I have a list of a whole bunch of auto-start persistence mechanisms, things that are going to run in the future, I have a list of all my things that have run because I've got the data coming out of my, for example, my Amcache databases. And I've got a list of all my running processes. I can grab all those hashes and I can start actually running those through vulnerability feeds now. And all of a sudden, I have a tool and a visibility that's going to be on par or at least better than tools like Nessus and Qualys in the context of identifying where I have active exposure of known vulnerabilities. So it doesn't have to be restricted to just the idea of malware hunting, per se, this tooling. I won't go through the pointers right now. That's in the slide for later. The second piece we need is a discovery engine. So discovery means, how do I find the endpoints in my estate? I, again, don't know about everyone's environment here, but I know that I've been into a good 150, 200 environments over the last 2 years, and I've never seen anyone who had a complete inventory and knew exactly where all the databases were or all the actual systems were. Very rarely. We just did a scan in one, can't talk about that one. There's oftentimes we will do scans of an estate, or you'll actually do a discovery process, and you'll find a lot of out-of-date endpoints. There was a bank recently that we did an engagement with where we actually did some scanning in, and using this, again, custom-built tooling. And what we were able to find was a bunch of Windows XP machines that everyone thought had been decommissioned, that were actively sitting in their actual same segments as all their payment gateways. It's a significant challenge and a significant problem when you have legacy systems sitting all throughout the estate. So the ways to deal with this are really to start basically creating a scanning engine. Now, you don't have to recreate this. I mean, you can use existing tools out there. You can use PowerShell or some of these other tools I've mentioned here. But my preference is, again, to put this into a service. I read it in C# and I'll set it up and I'll actually do the scan. So there's really 4 different ways that you can identify very quickly and easily your network segments or your network. You can do it by IP range. You can do it by sitters. You can pull out of Active Directory. Or you can use lists of custom IP addresses or host names. Bring them into your own set of tooling and be able to go out and query. So that's part 1 of it. Part 2 is not only once you actually identify the endpoints, you need to make sure the actual service is there and you have access. So the way to do that, or the way I've actually typically done that, and the way I've outlined here, is to actually validate the presence of certain services. Now, what's even neater about this is a lot of these services will actually leak information about what those actual endpoints are. So when you start making connections to, for example, printers, you'll be able to identify what the printers are. You'll have all that actual data sitting there. So it allows you to get a more complete view of your infrastructure and your network. And more importantly, where you have to send the surveys to. So transport and execution, again, how are you going to send it? There's a lot of different methods for doing this. So I'm typically involved in, because again, I'm from the Middle East, so it's typically going to be Windows sort of environments. Very rarely do we find a lot of Linux and Unix there. So in our context, WMI, we'll typically use that in order to deploy software out to the endpoints as an execution method. PS remoting. PS remoting is something everyone should turn on. I wish it was in more organizations by default. It's a nice little command that everyone should know. If you go to an endpoint and it's not enabled, enable it. It'll save you a lot of headaches and time if you're going to get into this kind of work. You can use remote scheduled tasks, the remote service manager, or again, you can use SSH. So my personal preference in terms of how I typically do this is I create a little droplet or a little dropper. So what I do is I push out a dropper to the endpoint. It goes and downloads a survey and then executes it. The way that it actually works is, and this is a little trick that I found ages ago, pen testers will typically use this kind of technique. So convert the dropper into a base 64. I'm losing a couple people, I think. That's fine. It's in the slide in terms of what we're doing. The second thing we need to do, or the fourth thing we need to do, is survey enrichment. So I've got all this data back. What am I going to do with it now? So ultimately, what you're aiming to do is to take it off, and what you're aiming to do is to remove a lot of the noise. So the easiest way to do that is to query a file reputation service, something like VirusTotal. So it'll allow you to really rapidly identify everything good and everything bad, and you can remove it from the scope of what you need to deal with. There's a lot of different threat intel resources out there. I put a couple in here as well. It's also worth noting that if you do this kind of program and you set this kind of thing up, I'm almost done. Thanks. If you set this kind of program up, there's a lot of commercial options that you'll find a lot of extra value out of. I'm a personal big fan of CrowdStrike's file reputation feeds. I find them to be absolutely exceptional pieces of work that they make available. Second thing we need to do is file analysis. So if I've got my samples back, or if I've identified something that's of interest, now I want to maybe take a look and understand a little bit more of the characteristics of it. So there's a lot of tools in the market that can help with this. And again, you can automate a lot of these processes as well and slap it all into a database so that you can present it back ultimately in a way that no one has to know how you did the work. There's two different kinds of services. And again, it's another point of caution. The challenge with the idea of submitting things to these public services is that the bad guys monitor them too. So this is actually one of the areas, if you start looking at standing up this kind of program, you might want to make it a little bit more private or pick up a subscription. So for a multi-AV scanner, the one that I've typically used in the past is OpSWAT. And for sandboxing, you have Hybrid Analysis, Palo Alto, and Joe Sandbox, and a couple of others that are more commercial in nature that allow you to get that data set that you want to have access to. So bringing it all together, how does it fit together? We have our hunt systems. So it could be one set of service, or it could be multiple services, or it could be a bunch of scripts you create. Again, how you want to do it is really up to you. You've got your threat intel providers and your reputation. You've got your surveys collecting what's running, what's triggered a run, and what's run in the past. You're enriching it all, and you're submitting samples off for further analysis, for static analysis as an example, to your file and malware analysis services that are secondary or third party, and bringing it all together so you can start actually understanding what's in your environment and actually doing some work. So what are the benefits of malware hunting? It's a lot of work ultimately to stand these things up, but there's some really important use cases. First, when we talk about on-demand use cases, there's really 4 of them. Sometimes enterprises have made very heavy investments in defensive technologies, and you just need to validate that those technologies are in fact working, or identify where you have gaps. So this kind of tooling and this kind of capability allows you to do that. Secondarily, sometimes you suspect something's happening in your environment, but you're not sure because the defensive tools aren't there, but you might have users that are complaining about performance. You might want to be able to just validate and check to make sure there's nothing on that endpoint. So this gives you that capability to go and do that kind of validation. Third, sometimes you know something is wrong. Most common case of that is endpoints that are beaconing. So I've got an endpoint that's actively beaconing, but none of my defensive tools are picking it up. So I don't know what to submit to the AV vendor in order to get help to clean it up, as an example. Fourthly, sometimes I've been hit already, and I need to validate that no secondary malware has been seeded. This is really common in the case of ransomware attacks. So these guys will come in and they'll actually hit your environment. Sometimes you pay, sometimes you don't pay, but they'll seed secondary malware so they have a backdoor in onto it. Does that make sense? Yeah. From a business impact point of view, it's important to do this on an ongoing basis. Early discovery saves time and saves money. And there's some really neat research that I can point you to. The Aberdeen group, Dell SecureWorks did some sponsorship of a study about 2.5 years ago now. It was using raw data from the Verizon data breach report. And they showed that if you can control dwell time and limit it to 30 days, you're looking at a business impact reduction of upwards of about 24%. If you can further compress that time down to 7 days, you're looking at upwards of a 77% reduction in business impact. And if you can further compress it down to 1 day, you're looking at upwards of a 97% reduction in business impact. It's in that kind of context that standing up a malware hunt program provides value in return on your investment. And that's it. That's my presentation today. So the idea is stop chasing security, accept malware will breach, independently validate the state of your endpoints, and keep it iterative and ongoing. That's it.
Excellent. Thank you, Robert. There's a question from an online viewer, or maybe from an very shy audience member here. Do the large multinational companies have the same security solutions in each country/branch? Hard to imagine that they are implemented same all over.
I've rarely seen that. There are a couple of situations where I've seen enterprises being consistent and being controlled that to the level that they do have the consistency. But what you often end up seeing is policy differences. So just to speak to that question, one of the other solutions that I advise is a technology company that does cyber maturity assessments. And in that particular solution, what we often find is you do an assessment and you roll it out, and 30% of the firewalls have been turned off. So there might be a policy where someone actually has the same control that's meant to be deployed everywhere, But if you don't have all the monitoring in place, it's really difficult to validate it. And oftentimes, there'll be exceptions and holes in your infrastructure. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. Any further questions?
Nope.
Very shy audience.
Cool.
Thank you for the excellent presentation.
No problem. Thank you.